A woman called a moving company in New York and suddenly realized something was terribly wrong. The employee who answered the phone told her that her 8-year-old daughter, Eliza, never showed up for work that day. At first, the woman said nothing. Then her breathing changed. Her voice started trembling. And before hanging up, she quietly said she needed to call 911 immediately. Just moments earlier, she had walked into her house and found the entire place destroyed. Furniture overturned. Papers scattered everywhere. And upstairs, behind a locked bedroom door, was something waiting that would horrify detectives for months to come. That night, the 10th of August 2005, investigators in New York began looking into what appeared to be a violent home invasion. But as the evidence started coming together, they realized the killer wasn't a stranger who broke into the house. The killer was someone who had already been standing beside the family the entire time. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please tell the like button. You'll save them a seat at the movies, but then you put your code on it instead. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early afternoon of Wednesday, the 10th of August 2005, 8-year-old Eliza Parsi was sitting on her bed in her Staten Island home, flipping through a fashion magazine. The house was quiet. Her mother, Seema, was at work, so Eliza had the place to herself until her own shift started later. Eliza had just graduated high school a few months earlier and was working as a clerk at a moving company. She was saving up for college, but her real dream was to move into Manhattan and work in the fashion industry. Still, she felt a little guilty about leaving. It would mean her mom would be all alone in the big house. Eliza's parents, who were both from Israel, had divorced about a year and a half before. Her father had moved back to Israel, leaving just her and her mom in New York. Eliza did have 2 older half-brothers from her mom's first marriage. One was also in Israel. The other, her 7-year-old half-brother Raviv, lived a short drive away. But they rarely saw him. Raviv was married with a new baby and was in charge of the family's struggling kosher cookie business. He was always busy, always stressed about money, and just didn't make it out to Staten Island much. Eliza got to the last page of her magazine and saw it was time to get ready for her 2 p.m. shift. But first, she wanted to check her messages on her online dating profiles. So she went over to her desk and logged into her computer. Back in 2005, internet dating was just taking off, and Eliza had made a few profiles to see what would happen. She'd started messaging and meeting up with men from all over the city, but she kept it a secret from her mother. She knew Seema wouldn't approve of her dating men who weren't from their Orthodox Jewish faith. Eliza knew this for a fact because it had happened with her last boyfriend, Hassan. He was a Muslim boy she'd met at her public high school. Her family had completely disapproved of the relationship because of his religion. The pressure became too much, and Eliza eventually broke up with him. So now, she was much more secretive. She'd make up excuses to go to other neighborhoods when really she was going on dates. She had even started secretly bringing some of the guys back to her house, always sneaking them in through the back door when her mom was at work. Eliza saw a few new messages and replied to them. Then she headed into the bathroom to take a shower. A few minutes later, she turned off the water and heard a noise from outside the bathroom. She'd heard a landscaping crew next door earlier, but this was different. It was a weird banging sound. Thinking it might just be the landscapers next door, Eliza stepped out of the shower and wrapped a towel tightly around herself. Then she slowly opened the bathroom door to see where the noise was coming from. But someone was already inside the house. That night, around 7:30 p.m., Eliza's mother, Seema, got home. She put her key in the front door, but it would only open a few inches. Something was blocking it. Confused, Seema shoved against the door until she could squeeze inside. The first thing she saw was that a heavy mirror had been propped against the door. Before she could process why, she turned on the lights and saw her living room was completely destroyed. Furniture was overturned, cabinets were open, and papers were everywhere. Sema immediately felt her heart start pounding. Someone had broken into the house. But then another thought hit her. Where was Eliza? Sema knew her daughter had been home. She started calling out her name, but there was no answer. She ran upstairs and saw that the door to Eliza's room was closed. She tried the handle, but it was locked. This was wrong. Eliza never locked her door. In a panic, Sema banged on the door, screaming Eliza's name. But there was only silence. She pulled out her phone and called the moving company. When Eliza's boss told her she'd never shown up for work, Sema's stomach dropped. With trembling hands, she hung up and dialed 911. About an hour later, Detective Michael Kenny of the NYPD arrived. The street was swarming with neighbors, and yellow crime scene tape was stretched across the front yard. He parked and walked to the house, where 2 patrol officers met him. They told him they'd responded to a robbery call, had to break down a locked bedroom door, and inside, they found the body of one 8-year-old Eliza Parsi. The officers said the whole house was torn apart, but they couldn't find any sign of a forced entry. They pointed to Sema, who was standing nearby with a young man. Kenny knew he'd have to talk to her, but first, he needed to see the scene for himself. Inside, the living room was a mess, but Kenny noticed that valuable items like the TV and stereo were sitting out in the open, untouched. That was unusual for a burglary. He went upstairs to Eliza's room. It was also ransacked. Clothes were everywhere, and the mattress was pulled off the bed, leaning against a wall. In the middle of the floor was Eliza's body. She was naked, with a towel bunched up underneath her. Kenny asked a crime scene tech if this was how they found her. The tech said no. When they first arrived, Eliza had been underneath the mattress with a pillow over her face. They had to move both to examine her. Kenny knelt down but couldn't see an obvious cause of death, no bullet or knife wounds. This suggested she might have been suffocated, maybe with that pillow. He asked if they'd found any signs of injury. The tech pointed to a few tiny drops of blood on the towel. They were small and could have been old. But all the details, a naked young woman, the mattress, the pillow, the blood, made Kenny suspect she had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. He told the tech to collect the blood and any other fluids as evidence. A few minutes later, Kenny went outside to speak with Sema. She was crying on the shoulder of a young man who immediately stepped forward when he saw Kenny. He demanded to know why they couldn't see Eliza and why the police weren't out arresting her killer. Kenny took a deep breath. This was clearly Eliza's brother, and his anger was understandable. Kenny calmly explained that to find the killer, he needed information, starting with where he and Sema had been that day. The man lowered his voice and introduced himself as Raviv. He and Sema both said they had been at work all day and had alibis. Kenny then asked if they knew anyone who would want to harm Eliza. He saw them exchange a knowing glance. Raviv immediately said Kenny should look into her ex-boyfriend Hassan. Sema added that just a few weeks ago, Eliza had woken up to find Hassan sitting at the end of her bed, just staring at her. She said it terrified Eliza, who had no idea how he'd gotten inside. Before Kenny could ask another question, Raviv suddenly started yelling at someone across the yard. "Get out. We don't want you here." Kenny turned and saw a teenage boy standing there, looking scared. Raviv then turned back to Kenny and yelled at him to arrest that boy, Hassan, because he was the one who killed Eliza. Late that night, Detective Kenny sat in an interrogation room with Hassan. So far, Hassan had been cooperative, but he didn't have a solid alibi for the time Eliza was likely killed. Kenny had taken a DNA sample from him, as well as from Sema and Raviv, to compare against the evidence found at the scene. But DNA results took weeks back in 2005, so Kenny hoped for a confession. He asked Hassan if he had ever snuck into Eliza's house. Hassan didn't deny it. He admitted he had, but insisted he was just trying to talk to her to get back together. He said Eliza wasn't terrified, just annoyed, and told him to leave. Kenny noted the difference between Hassan's story and Seema's. He asked why Eliza's family disliked him so much. Hassan hung his head and said it was about religion. He was Muslim and they were Orthodox Jewish. Kenny wasn't sure what to believe. Was Hassan an obsessive ex-boyfriend, or were they just star-crossed lovers? Either way, he had a motive and a history of sneaking into her house. But with no confession and no hard evidence, Kenny had to let him go. The next day was Eliza's funeral, held so quickly due to Orthodox custom. Kenny had just received the autopsy report. It confirmed Eliza died from asphyxiation, likely smothered by the pillow. The medical examiner also found semen showing she'd had sex within 24 hours of her death and skin cells under her fingernails suggesting she fought back. But here was the twist. The report concluded the sex had been consensual. There were no signs of sexual violence. This meant the killer was likely a romantic partner, which seemed to clear her family. But it also didn't seem to be a random burglar since nothing was stolen. At the synagogue, Kenny saw two groups, members of the Orthodox community and Eliza's friends from school. He stood in the back of the men's section and watched. The atmosphere was solemn. Then, suddenly, the energy in the room shifted. Everyone turned to look at the entrance. It was Hassan. He was trying to make his way to the casket. Raviv saw him, marched straight over, shoved him, and yelled at him to get out. Before a fight could break out, other men separated them and escorted Hassan out of the building. 2 weeks later, on August 24th, Kenny was with the NYPD computer crime unit. Eliza's friends had told him about her secret online dating life. The IT specialists dug into her computer and found a message thread with a man named Jonathan. They were making plans to meet at her house for sex on August 9th, the day before she was killed. Eliza told him to come to her house while her mom was at work and that she'd leave the back door unlocked so he could sneak in. This plan matched the crime scene perfectly. Kenny tracked Jonathan down. He admitted he'd gone to her house and they'd had consensual sex, but he insisted he never went back to Staten Island after that. He gave a DNA sample without hesitation. Weeks passed and the case went cold. Kenny had nothing solid on Hassan or Jonathan. Then, on September 13th, the medical examiner called. The DNA results were in. The semen sample didn't match the skin cells under Eliza's fingernails. There was DNA from two different men. The semen belonged to Jonathan, confirming his story of consensual sex the day before. The skin cells found under Eliza's fingernails from her desperate fight for her life belonged to her half-brother, Raviv. Raviv was angry at his mother. The family cookie business she'd passed to him was failing, and he felt humiliated living in his in-laws' basement with his wife and new baby. He knew Seema had money from her recent divorce, money he felt was rightfully his. So on August 10th, instead of driving his delivery route, he went to his mother's house to steal it. He didn't know Eliza's work schedule had changed and that she would be home. Before searching the house, Raviv dragged a heavy mirror in front of the front door, creating a barricade in case someone unexpectedly came home. When he went into Eliza's room, he was shocked to find her coming out of the bathroom. He knew she would tell their mother what he was doing. In a panic, he tackled her, smothered her with a pillow until she stopped fighting, and then staged the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. He then left, only to return hours later after his mother called him, pretending to be a grieving brother. Raviv eventually pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. In the end, the person demanding justice the loudest outside the crime scene was the same person who had killed Eliza only hours earlier. Raviv had publicly blamed Hassan, comforted his grieving mother, and stood beside detectives pretending to mourn his sister. But the entire time, the killer had already been there. Hours earlier, when Seema called Eliza's workplace searching for her daughter, Eliza was already dead inside the house. And the person she should have been safest around turned out to be the one she needed protection from most. Thanks for listening. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments below. If you want to watch more true crime stories, check out the playlist linked on screen. Until next time. Daniel Dukes always seemed to have an issue with respecting boundaries. He was not a malicious person, but he had this incredibly strange quirk where he simply did not believe that rules or walls applied to him. If he wanted to go somewhere or if he wanted to see something, he would just go and do it, completely ignoring the potential consequences or the impact it might have on other people. In the spring of 1996, when Daniel was 24 years old, he became absolutely obsessed with a computer game series called Ultima. Back in the early days of personal computer gaming, Ultima was a massive hit. It was this huge, open-world, role-playing fantasy game that captured the imaginations of millions of people around the world, and Daniel was one of those people who became completely consumed by it. He played it for hours and hours every single day, and eventually his obsession shifted from the game itself to the man who had actually created it. Daniel decided that he needed to meet this creator in person. He did some digging, figured out exactly what city the creator lived in, and then managed to track down his actual home address. One night, in the middle of the night, Daniel walked up to this man's house. He stood on the front porch and knocked on the door, expecting the creator to just open up, welcome him inside, and strike up a conversation. But of course, it was the middle of the night, and nobody answered the door. Most people would have taken the hint, realized how inappropriate it was to knock on a stranger's door at that hour, and gone home. But Daniel did not see things that way. He got incredibly frustrated that the creator was not answering the door, so he walked away for a little while to let his frustration cool down. But a couple of hours later, he came right back to the house. This time, he decided he was not going to let a locked door stand in his way. He walked around the side of the house, found a window, broke the glass, and climbed right inside. Once he was inside, he did not steal anything, and he did not look for any valuables. Instead, he just wandered upstairs, found one of the guest bedrooms, climbed into the bed, pulled the covers over himself, and fell fast asleep. The next morning, the creator of the game woke up, walked down the hallway, and opened the door to the bedroom. He was absolutely shocked to find this random stranger, Daniel, sleeping soundly in his bed. The creator immediately began screaming at Daniel, telling him to get out of his house right now. But Daniel was completely unfazed by the shouting. He just looked at the creator and told him that he wanted to keep sleeping in the bed. He was so calm and casual about it, which only made the creator more upset. Realizing he could not reason with this intruder, the creator called the police. When the police officers arrived, they found Daniel still lying in the bed, completely relaxed. They had to physically haul him out of the bed, pull him out of the house, and place him under arrest for breaking and entering and criminal trespassing. But this arrest did not do anything to change Daniel's behavior. Just 1 year later, in 1997, Daniel would find himself in trouble with the law again for the exact same issue of ignoring boundaries. This time, he was in Orlando, Florida, and he had decided to go to SeaWorld. After the park had closed for the night and all of the guests and staff had gone home, Daniel snuck onto the property. He wandered around the dark, empty park until he came across the manatee exhibit. He looked at the manatees swimming around in the water, and instead of just watching them, he decided he wanted to get in the water with them. So he stripped down and jumped into the exhibit, spending the night swimming around and playing with the manatees. When security finally found him, they called the police, and Daniel was arrested once again for trespassing. But despite his growing criminal history, the people who actually knew Daniel described him as being far from a hardened criminal. They said he was actually a very gentle, quiet, pot-smoking hippie who just adored animals and wanted to be close to them. He did not want to hurt anyone, and he did not want to steal anything. He just wanted to experience things on his own terms without any boundaries. In 1999, when Daniel was 27 years old, he joined a small religious community of people who practiced Hare Krishna, which is a branch of Hinduism. The devotees are well known for repeating their chant, Hare Krishna, over and over again as a form of meditation. Daniel moved into the community temple, but during his stay there, he basically blew off all of his responsibilities. He did not really practice the religion, and he did not help the other members with the daily chores like cleaning the temple or preparing the communal meals. Instead, Daniel spent virtually all of his time sitting in the temple's garden, feeding the wild birds that came to roost there. He became completely obsessed with these birds. He even kept a detailed notebook where he diligently tracked every single bird that entered the garden. He would write down what species they were, what they looked like, how much food he had given them, and how they behaved. To Daniel, these birds were the only thing that mattered. After about a month of living this way, Daniel abruptly walked up to the other worshippers in the temple and announced that he was going to be taking a vow of silence. This announcement really confused the other members of the community because the Hare Krishna tradition does not actually encourage its members to take vows of silence. This was just something Daniel had decided he wanted to do on his own. Right before he stopped speaking entirely, he also informed them that he would be leaving the community. So he took his vow of silence, packed up his few belongings, and walked out the door. After leaving the temple, Daniel began traveling across the country, committing a series of petty offenses in South Carolina, Washington, Texas, and eventually back in Florida. Because of his strict vow of silence, these encounters with law enforcement were incredibly bizarre. In Florida, he was arrested for stealing a candy bar at a 7-Eleven. When he was brought before a judge in court, he refused to speak a single word. Instead, he had to write on a piece of paper that he denied the charge. Ultimately, the judge sentenced him to 3 days in jail for the theft. After completing his short stint in the Florida jail, Daniel was just on relief, and he immediately decided that he wanted to go back to Orlando, Florida to visit SeaWorld again. It is assumed he wanted to check on the manatees he had swam with years prior, or perhaps see some of the other animals in the park. When Daniel arrived at SeaWorld during normal operating hours, he made his way over to the Killer Whale Stadium. A demonstration was about to start, where professional trainers would swim around in a massive enclosure with these giant killer whales. Other visitors who were sitting in the stands that day would later recall seeing Daniel. They said they remembered him because he was standing in the crowd, completely transfixed, watching the show with his mouth wide open. He looked absolutely fascinated by these massive creatures swimming through the water. But Daniel's biggest reaction came when the trainers brought out Tilikum. Tilikum was the biggest killer whale ever held in captivity, measuring over 22 feet long and weighing over 12,000 pounds. He was an absolute giant, and Daniel could not take his eyes off him. He was completely taken with Tilikum. That night, after the park shut down and all of the visitors and employees left, Daniel returned to SeaWorld. This time, he was wearing a bathing suit underneath his clothes. He walked up to the outer fence, hopped over it, and snuck back into the park, using the exact same methods he had used when he broke in to swim with the manatees years earlier. Somehow, Daniel managed to navigate through the entire park without being spotted by any of the security guards or picked up by any of the surveillance cameras. He made his way directly to the killer whale enclosure. He hopped the fence surrounding the massive pool, took off his shirt, took off his shoes, and left them on the concrete deck. Now, wearing nothing but his bathing suit, Daniel leaped into the cold, deep water of the pool to be with Tilikum. When Daniel had jumped into the manatee exhibit years before, he told people he just wanted to play with them, so investigators assumed he had the exact same intention when he jumped into the pool with Tilikum. He probably thought he could just swim alongside this massive predator and play with him like a friend. But unfortunately, Tilikum was indeed eager to play, but not in the way Daniel had imagined. The massive killer whale quickly grabbed Daniel by his swim shorts, dragging him down to the bottom of the pool. Tilikum held him under, dragging him back and forth along the bottom of the enclosure until Daniel drowned. After Daniel had passed away, Tilikum continued to play with his body, thrashing him around in the water, throwing him up and down, and ripping off pieces of his clothing and his body. Finally, Tilikum draped Daniel's lifeless body over his massive back, and that is where he kept him for the rest of the night. The next morning, when the SeaWorld staff showed up to start their shift, they walked out to the killer whale pool and made a horrifying discovery. They saw Daniel Duke's body draped over the back of Tilikum. The staff immediately tried to recover the body, but Tilikum was highly protective of his new toy and refused to let them near it. Whenever they tried to get close, Tilikum would swim away or pull the body back under the water. Eventually, the staff realized they could not safely get the body away from the 12,000-pound whale while he was in the water. They had to use a special medical hoist to lift Tilikum completely out of the water and suspend him in the air so they could safely recover Daniel's body. Ultimately, the medical examiner ruled Daniel's death as an accidental drowning, citing his poor decision-making and hypothermia as contributing factors. Because it was ruled an accident caused by Daniel's own trespassing, Tilikum was not punished and he remained at SeaWorld. And that brings us to our next story, which takes us from the depths of a killer whale tank to the deep, dark underground of Mexico. In the year 1910, a group of miners was working inside of the Nica mine in Chihuahua, Mexico. As they were drilling deep into the earth looking for valuable minerals, their drill suddenly punctured through the solid rock, revealing a massive flooded cavern. The miners realized that they could not explore this space while it was full of water, so they brought in heavy equipment and pumped all of the water out of the cavern. Once the water was gone, the miners stepped inside, and they were absolutely amazed by what they saw. The walls and the ceiling of the cavern were completely covered in massive, beautiful gypsum crystals. It looked like an underground wonderland. But although these crystals were incredibly beautiful, they were far less valuable than what the miners were actually searching for, which was silver. The miners realized that trying to mine these crystals would not make them much money, so instead of destroying them, they decided to do something honorable. They went to the local residents in the area and told them about this incredible natural wonder they had just uncovered. They told the locals that they really ought to protect this cave and keep people from ruining it. The locals agreed, and for the next 100 years, the people of Chihuahua kept this cave, which they nicknamed the Cave of Swords, under lock and key. They made sure that no unauthorized people could go inside, preserving the amazing crystals for generations. Fast forward to the year 2000. Two miners were working inside of a different mine, not the Nica mine where the Cave of Swords was located, but another mine that was situated right up against it. They were drilling down deep, working at the exact same depth as the Cave of Swords, but they had no idea that they were actually drilling directly underneath it. As they were working, their drill suddenly broke through the solid rock, opening up yet another underground flooded cavern. Because these two miners did not realize how close they were to the Cave of Swords, they did not suspect that there would be any crystals inside this new cavern. They figured it was just another flooded pocket of earth that might contain silver. So, just like the miners had done 90 years earlier, they brought in pumps, drained all of the water out of the cavern, and prepared to go inside to investigate. Once the water was fully drained, the two men crawled down through the narrow opening and stepped inside. When they shined their flashlights around, their jaws dropped. They were standing in a massive cavern, and coming out of the walls, the floor, and the ceiling were these absolutely enormous crystals. These crystals were 10 to 15 times larger than the biggest crystals inside of the Cave of Swords. In fact, these were literally the largest gypsum crystals ever discovered anywhere in the world, with some of them measuring over 30 feet long. The cave looked like Superman's Fortress of Solitude, an unbelievable alien landscape of giant, glowing white pillars. This new cavern would eventually be named the Giant Crystal Cave, and just like the Cave of Swords, it was handed over to the local authorities to protect. Now, you would think that with the discovery of the largest crystals in the world, people would be lining up like crazy to get inside these caves to see this spectacular natural wonder. But the truth is, nobody wants to go inside these caves because they are literal death traps. Even though both of the caves had all of their water pumped out, the humidity level inside of them remains at a constant 100%. What this means is that the air is so saturated with moisture that if you stay inside the cave for too long, your lungs will actually begin to fill up with water. You will literally drown in the air, breathing in the moisture until you suffocate. Scientists who studied the cave estimated that it would only take about 10 minutes for a normal person to drown this way if they were not wearing a highly specialized breathing device that was pumping dry air directly into their lungs. But even if you were wearing one of those special air tanks, the cave would still find a way to kill you very quickly. The temperature inside the giant crystal cave regularly exceeds 130 degrees Fahrenheit. If you combine that extreme heat with the 100% humidity and the tight, enclosed space of an underground cavern, you get a natural oven. If you stay in there for more than an hour, the heat will literally cook you alive. Because of these extreme dangers, the only people allowed to go inside the giant crystal cave are professional researchers wearing heavy, specialized protective suits and breathing apparatuses, and even they are only allowed to stay inside for a few minutes at a time. But in the year 2001, just 1 year after the giant crystal cave was discovered, one of the mine workers who had actually helped to drain the water out of the cavern decided that he wanted to get his hands on one of those incredible crystals. He figured that since he had helped prepare the cave, he deserved a souvenir. He knew the layout of the mine perfectly, and he knew how to access that specific locked-off section without anyone noticing. He waited until he was alone, and then he made his way down into the depths of the mine and slipped inside the giant crystal cave. The only piece of equipment he brought with him was a handsaw. His plan was very simple. He was going to walk inside, find a medium-sized crystal, saw off a piece of it, put it in his bag, and walk out. He figured the whole thing would only take him a couple of minutes, which was well within the safety window before the heat and humidity would start to affect him. He crawled into the massive cavern, looking around at the giant pillars of white crystal. He identified a crystal hanging from the ceiling that he thought would make a perfect souvenir. He climbed up onto some rocks, reached up with his handsaw, and began sawing away at the base of the crystal. But as he was sawing, the vibrations and the pressure dislodged a massive, heavy chunk of the crystal from the ceiling. Before he could react, the heavy crystal came crashing down, hitting him and pinning him tightly against the rocky floor of the cave. When the crystal fell on him, it did not kill him right away, but it trapped him completely. He could not move, and he could not lift the heavy crystal off his body. At this point, a terrifying reality must have sunk in for this worker very quickly. He had not told a single soul where he was going because what he was doing was completely illegal. He knew that security did not regularly patrol the inside of the cave, and he knew that nobody would be coming down to check on it anytime soon because the public was strictly forbidden from entering. He was completely alone, pinned in the dark, in an environment that was over 130 degrees with 100% humidity. A couple of days later, a group of authorized researchers made their way down into the giant crystal cave to conduct some scheduled studies. As they shined their lights around the cavern, they made a horrific discovery. They found the mine worker still pinned beneath the massive chunk of crystal that he had tried to cut from the ceiling. It was unclear to the medical examiners whether the man had died from his lungs filling with water due to the extreme humidity, or if he had been cooked alive by the oppressive heat. But either way, he was deceased. Following this tragic incident, the security surrounding the giant crystal cave and the Cave of Swords was tightened significantly, and today, both caves remain strictly off limits to the public, protected as highly dangerous natural wonders. And that brings us to our final story for today, which takes us to the beautiful but highly deceptive shores of Hawaii. On June 30th, 2002, an 18-year-old named Daniel Dick was on vacation with his mother and his two younger brothers on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. Daniel was an incredibly bright, charismatic, and kind young man who had just graduated from high school in Los Angeles, California. He was a natural leader, and during his senior year, he had served as his school's student body president. He was the kind of person who loved being around people and always wanted to make everyone feel included. He was famous among his classmates for constantly inviting huge groups of students over to his house for dinner, and girls at his school would call him all the time just to get his advice about their relationships because he was such a good listener. Daniel also had a huge heart for people who were struggling. He would frequently seek out troubled teens in his neighborhood and befriend them, doing everything he could to help guide them back onto the straight and narrow path. Before leaving for this family vacation, Daniel had been working a part-time job at a local grocery store, and he was excited to start college at California State University in the fall. He had his entire life ahead of him, and he was determined to make the most of his trip to Hawaii. On the morning of June 30th, Daniel decided to head down to the beach. His plan was to do some swimming, lay out in the sun, and just relax. Not long after he arrived, he struck up a conversation with three girls who were also hanging out on the sand. They chatted for about 30 minutes, laughing and getting to know each other, when Daniel noticed something interesting further down the beach. He pointed toward a rocky area and asked the girls if they wanted to climb over the nearby fence to check out the blowhole. Now, a blowhole is a very interesting natural geological feature. It is a narrow hole situated on the flat volcanic rocks right at the water edge. These holes are usually formed over thousands of years by molten lava flowing underground. As the lava cools and recedes, it leaves behind a hollow tube that connects the surface of the rock to the ocean below. When large waves crash against the shoreline, the water is forced into the underwater entrance of the tube and is rocketed up through the narrow opening on the surface, creating a massive, spectacular geyser of water that shoots high into the air. If you stand back and watch it from a safe distance, a blowhole is not dangerous at all. It is just a beautiful, awe-inspiring natural phenomenon to watch. But the beach where Daniel and the girls were hanging out was located right next to an infamously dangerous spot called the Halona Blowhole. The reason the Halona Blowhole was so dangerous is because the underwater tunnel it connected to was situated in some of the most violent, turbulent water in all of Hawaii. When the massive ocean swells came barreling into the coast, the water would rush through the tunnel with unbelievable force, shooting a geyser of water 30 feet or higher into the air. To make sure that visitors understood just how dangerous this area was, the local authorities had put up a sturdy fence all the way around the blowhole, and they had posted multiple signs warning people to stay back and not go any closer. To give you an idea of the sheer power of the water moving through that natural plumbing system, if you were standing on the safe side of the fence, you could actually feel the solid ground shaking beneath your feet every single time a wave rumbled through the underwater tunnel and exploded out of the blowhole. According to Daniel's family and friends, he was not a reckless or foolish person, but he was incredibly adventurous. He loved experiencing the raw power of nature, and when he saw the blowhole, his curiosity got the better of him. He could not stand the idea of just watching it from behind the safety fence. He wanted to get right up close to it. In fact, he turned to the three girls and told them that his goal was to stand right over the hole and feel the force of the water hit him directly in the chest. He thought it would be an incredible, exhilarating experience. The girls immediately told him that this was a terrible idea. They pointed to the warning signs and told him that the water was far too powerful and that he could easily get hurt. But Daniel was insistent. He was confident in his physical strength, and he believed he could handle it. He began walking over to the rocky ledge where he could climb up and get over the fence. The three girls decided to walk over with him, but they stopped short of the fence, refusing to go any further. As Daniel made his way toward the rocks, he passed by a couple who were relaxing on the beach. He gave them a friendly wave, climbed up the steep volcanic rocks, and hopped over the safety fence. He walked directly toward the opening of the blowhole. He stood there for a moment, carefully timing his movements. He waited for a large wave to come in, shoot a geyser of water into the air, and then recede. As soon as the water went back down and there was a temporary break in the action, Daniel walked right up to the edge of the opening. The hole was not very wide, and Daniel positioned himself right at the rim. He bent his knees and arched his body forward, hovering his chest directly over the dark opening, waiting for the next rush of water. Within seconds, a wave came through the underwater tunnel. A geyser of water shot out of the blowhole, hitting Daniel directly in the chest. The force of the water was incredibly strong, and it staggered him, knocking him back a few steps. At this point, the three girls who were watching from behind the fence, along with the couple Daniel had passed on the beach, began screaming at him at the top of their lungs. They yelled for him to get away from the hole and get back behind the fence before he got hurt. But Daniel did not listen. Instead of stepping back to safety, he walked right back to the edge of the opening and leaned over it once again. But this time, a massive, unusually powerful wave came barreling through the underground tunnel. Before Daniel could react, the water rocketed up through the blowhole with immense force. The blast of water was so powerful that it lifted Daniel completely off his feet, launching him about 5 feet into the air. The water spun his body around, turning him completely upside down so that his head was pointed straight down toward the ground. As the water pressure subsided, Daniel fell back down, going head first directly into the narrow opening of the blowhole. The couple and the three girls who witnessed this horrifying moment described his body position as being a perfect dive. And the tragic truth is, in order to actually fall into the blowhole, you would have to enter in a perfect dive position. The opening of the Halona blowhole is extremely narrow. It consists of an 8-foot-long, tightly enclosed vertical tube of rough volcanic rock. At the bottom of this 8-foot tube, the space opens up into a larger chamber, which is shaped very much like the inside of a teapot. Inside this chamber, the water is a vicious, churning washing machine of foam and current, which is constantly fed by the long underground tunnel leading out to the open sea. Once Daniel went headfirst down into that hole, his downward momentum, combined with his streamlined body position, forced him all the way through the narrow 8-foot tube and right into the teapot chamber. And once a person is inside that chamber, there is absolutely no way to climb back up. The walls of the tube are completely vertical, slick with water, and far too narrow and smooth to get any kind of grip or leverage. You cannot force your way back up against the gravity and the constant rush of water. The only other way out of that chamber is to swim through the underground tunnel that leads out to the open ocean. But the problem was that massive, violent waves were constantly pounding their way into that tunnel from the sea, pushing water up into the chamber. Anyone who tried to swim out through that tunnel would be fighting against an incredibly powerful incoming current, and they would likely be slammed against the jagged rock walls or trapped underwater. The moment Daniel disappeared into the blowhole, the couple on the beach and the three girls immediately panicked. They ran over the rocks, hopped over the safety fence, and rushed to the edge of the hole. They stared down into the dark opening, screaming Daniel's name, hoping to hear him answer. At the same time, they began shouting to the other people on the beach, telling them to call 911 immediately. As they stood there waiting and yelling for him, they could feel the solid rock beneath their feet start to shake again. Another wave was coming. A second later, a massive geyser of water erupted from the blowhole, spraying all over them. They knew that every single time the blowhole erupted, the chamber below was completely filled with rushing, turbulent water. If Daniel was still alive down there, he was being completely submerged in water and slammed against the rocks for 30 seconds or more with every single wave that hit the coast. By the time the emergency rescue crews and the police arrived at the scene, Daniel had been trapped inside the blowhole for a significant amount of time. Nobody had heard any signs of life from inside the hole, and nobody had seen him. The situation was looking incredibly grim. The responding police officers and lifeguards assessed the situation, but they quickly realized that the water conditions were far too dangerous to send any rescue divers down into the blowhole or into the surrounding ocean. It was high tide, and the waves were crashing against the rocks with extreme violence. The police explained to Daniel's frantic family that if they sent a diver into the blowhole or the underwater tunnel right now, that diver would almost certainly be killed by the force of the water. They had no choice but to wait until low tide the following day to conduct a proper search. The best the rescue team could do in the meantime was to lower a heavy weighted line down through the opening of the blowhole. They anchored the top of the rope securely on the outside deck, hoping that by some absolute miracle, Daniel was still alive in the chamber and would be able to grab onto the line. Even if he could not pull himself up through the narrow tube to safety, holding onto the rope would at least allow him to keep his head above water and prevent him from being swept out to sea by the undercurrent. But as the hours passed, there was no movement on the line. The next morning, when low tide finally arrived, the ocean calmed down just enough for the emergency divers to safely enter the water. They began searching the area around the Halona blowhole, focusing on the underwater tunnel and the surrounding cove. It did not take them long to find him. The divers discovered Daniel's body floating in the water near the outer entrance of the underground tunnel, where the ocean water gets sucked into the blowhole system. During the night, as the tide receded, the powerful currents had eventually pulled his body out of the teapot chamber, through the long underwater tunnel, and out into the open sea. It was impossible for the medical examiners to determine exactly how long Daniel had survived after falling into the blowhole, or if he had ever attempted to swim through the tunnel to escape. But ultimately, the cause of death was ruled as drowning. Following the tragedy, Daniel's devastated mother was determined to make sure that no other family would ever have to go through the horrific pain of losing a child to the blowhole. She started a petition asking the local government to install a heavy metal grate over the opening of the Halona blowhole. She argued that a metal grate would allow the water to shoot up safely while preventing any future visitors from falling into the deadly tube. But her proposal was met with a lot of pushback and criticism from the local residents of Hawaii. The locals argued that the blowhole was a precious natural landmark that should not be altered or defaced with man-made structures. They believed that the problem was not the blowhole itself, but rather the fact that people did not respect the warning signs or the immense power of nature. They argued that the fence and the signs were more than enough warning, and that people needed to take personal responsibility for their safety when visiting these beautiful but dangerous locations. Ultimately, the government decided not to install the grate. Today, the sturdy fence still surrounds the Halona blowhole, and the warning signs are still clearly posted telling visitors to stay back. But the opening to the blowhole remains completely uncovered, a stark reminder of the incredible, unforgiving power of the natural world. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Around 4:45 p.m. on the 11th of February 1995, a bleak and somber atmosphere blanketed Northumberland, a quiet, sprawling rural county in northern England. Amidst the torrential downpour pounding mercilessly from the sky, 50-year-old Eric Tollett sat at his desk inside his office. Eric was the owner of a successful furniture factory located in the area. From his vantage point, the only sound that broke the silence was the heavy, rhythmic thumping of rainwater beating against the metal roof. An intense, low-pressure weather system was moving through the region, spawning a thunderstorm so fierce it was rarely seen in those parts. Looking out the window at the worsening conditions, Eric couldn't help but smile with a sense of relief. Hours earlier, realizing how hazardous the weather was becoming, he made the executive decision to close the factory early. He sent all of his employees home so they could remain safely indoors before the storm reached its peak. Eric felt incredibly grateful that he was finally in a financial position to offer his workers a paid day off like this. Things had not always been so easy for him. 16 years prior, Eric had poured every single penny of his life savings, scraping together whatever cash he could find just to make the investment and buy this property. After purchasing it, the building was practically a derelict shell, requiring a massive, grueling renovation to transform it into a functional furniture factory where he could actually manufacture and sell goods. Now, after more than a decade and a half of relentless hard work, his business was highly successful. A single day of lost profits because of a storm was no longer a major concern. Instead of worrying about the numbers, Eric was simply using the quiet afternoon to catch up on some lingering administrative paperwork and enjoy some downtime with his family. Present at the factory with Eric that day was his girlfriend, Leslie, who was relaxing by the office window, casually watching the rain bounce off the glass. Also visiting was Eric's 60-year-old brother, Donald. To keep things lively, Donald had taken Leslie's 8-year-old son over to the factory's attached garage to play and pass the time while the storm raged outside. The office was peaceful, save for the rustling of papers as Eric shuffled through his files, when suddenly the office door swung open with a violent thud. Leslie's 8-year-old son burst into the room, his face completely pale and his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The boy was entirely alone. Donald was nowhere to be seen. Before Eric or Leslie could even utter a syllable to ask what was wrong, the child blurted out in sheer terror that Donald had suddenly collapsed onto the floor over in the attached garage. Initially, Eric froze, his mind struggling to process the sudden news. However, the first thought that flashed through his mind concerned his brother's well-being. Donald was 60 years old and had a history of underlying health issues. Hearing the boy say that Donald had collapsed triggered an immediate alarm bell in Eric's head. Oh my goodness, did he just have a heart attack? But on the other hand, a small, rational part of him wondered if the 8-year-old was simply overreacting to something completely benign. Whatever the case may be, Eric knew instantly that he had to drop everything and rush over to check on Donald. Eric and Leslie threw their paperwork aside and sprinted after the boy. Because the garage was directly attached to the main factory building, they were able to run straight through the interior corridors, never having to step foot outside into the raging storm. The moment the three of them reached the doorway of the attached garage, they were met with the harrowing sight of Donald lying completely motionless on the concrete floor. Before Eric could run over to his brother to assess his condition, he instinctively stopped right in the doorway. Turning sharply to Leslie and her son, he gave a firm, urgent command. "Go back to my office and call 911 right now. I'll be in there as soon as I can." Leslie nodded quickly, grabbing her son's hand and turning around to sprint back to the office. The moment they were out of sight, Eric rushed into the garage and knelt down right next to his brother's limp body. Leaning in close, Eric could tell immediately that Donald was not breathing. Trembling, he began feeling around for any pulse or sign of life. But right at that exact moment, something bizarre and terrifying happened. Eric suddenly felt an incredible, overwhelming tightness seize his chest. His lungs constricted, a sharp pain shot through him, and the air around him seemed to vanish into thin air. Before he could even comprehend what was happening or attempt to crawl back toward the doorway, his vision went pitch black. He lost consciousness instantly and collapsed onto the floor, right next to his dying brother. The horrific truth behind this mysterious phenomenon lay in a dark secret from the property's past, one that Eric had forgotten long ago. 16 years before Eric purchased the building to start his furniture business, the structure had served an entirely different purpose. It was a coal processing plant. Because of that specific history, there was a literal coal mine shaft entry directly connected to the warehouse structure. In the old days, coal would be brought straight up out of the mine through this entrance to be processed inside. When Eric bought the property, he was well aware of the abandoned mine shaft. However, the mine had been out of use for decades. The entrance leading down into the subterranean tunnels had been completely boarded up with thick wooden planks. Seeing that it played no role in his daily operations and posed no obvious threat, Eric hadn't given the mine a single thought in over 15 years. What Eric didn't know was that deep within the pitch-black, isolated void of the abandoned mine, a lethal toxic gas known as choke damp had been silently accumulating in massive quantities over the years. Choke damp is a suffocating cocktail of gases, primarily composed of carbon dioxide and nitrogen, which completely strips the oxygen out of an environment. On that exact afternoon, the severe low-pressure storm system outside caused a drastic drop in atmospheric pressure. This sudden change created a natural vacuum effect, literally pulling the highly concentrated choke damp gases up from the depths of the mine. The toxic fumes seeped out through the rotting cracks of the boarded-up entrance. Because the attached garage was a closed, poorly ventilated space, the deadly gas built up rapidly inside the room, transforming the garage into an invisible, highly lethal gas chamber capable of knocking out any living being within seconds. Donald had walked into the garage first, unknowingly inhaling the toxic air, which caused him to pass out and tragically suffocate to death. Eric had rushed in second, falling victim to the exact same oxygen-deprived environment. Fortunately, Eric's quick thinking in ordering Leslie and her son back to the office saved their lives, preventing them from stepping into the death trap. Leslie managed to dial emergency services just in time. When the paramedics and fire department arrived, they utilized proper breathing apparatuses to enter the garage. They quickly dragged both Eric and Donald out into the fresh air. Though Donald could not be revived due to the prolonged exposure, Eric still possessed a faint, flickering pulse. He was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. After intensive medical treatment, Eric miraculously regained consciousness and survived the ordeal, though he was left to carry the profound grief of losing his brother to an invisible, silent killer. At 10 a.m. on the 10th of September 2022, a profound sense of tranquility surrounded a small vessel sailing through the Pacific Ocean. The boat was floating less than a mile off the eastern coast of New Zealand, gliding over perfectly calm, light blue water. Standing on the deck was Diana Stewart, a 8-year-old woman with a passion for capturing the raw beauty of the natural world. As she looked out across the horizon, she spotted a magnificent albatross bird soaring gracefully across the clear sky. Reacting with practiced ease, she lifted her camera, adjusted her lens, and snapped a picture. Diana was an accomplished wildlife photographer and a dedicated member of the Nature Photography Society of New Zealand. She, along with 9 other avid members of the society, had chartered this specific boat for a highly anticipated birdwatching and photography excursion. So far, the trip had absolutely lived up to the immense hype. They had spent the last 2 hours sailing around the pristine waters, happily photographing a variety of beautiful, rare birds and unique marine wildlife. To top it all off, they had even been lucky enough to witness a couple of massive whales breaching in the distance. By all accounts, it had been a fantastic and highly successful day on the water. At this point, the group had finished their scheduled tour and the skipper was making his way back toward the shore. As the boat cruised along, Diana kept her eyes peeled, looking out for any last-minute photography opportunities that might present themselves. While scanning the water for more birds, something large caught her attention. There was a massive shadow moving just beneath the surface near the boat. It was moving at an angle, heading directly toward the vessel. Initially, Diana couldn't quite make out the shape through the ripples of the water, but then the image suddenly came into sharp focus. It was an enormous whale, and it was swimming so fast that it appeared it would pass right underneath them. Excited by the prospect of a close-up encounter, Diana pulled out her camera once more to capture the moment. But in the next split second, the worst possible scenario unfolded. The whale did not swim safely under the boat. Instead, it rammed directly into the side of the vessel with immense force. Before Diana or anyone else could react, the boat lurched violently onto its side and flipped completely upside down. Within a heartbeat, Diana and the rest of the passengers and crew were violently thrown off the deck and plunged into the frigid ocean water. The moment Diana hit the freezing water, the shock of the temperature threatened to paralyze her. Fortunately, she was wearing a modern automatic inflation life jacket. The second it was submerged, the mechanism triggered, and the vest quickly filled with air, forcing her back up toward the surface. Disoriented, gasping for air, and struggling to get her bearings in the shockingly cold water, Diana opened her eyes, only to be met with absolute pitch-black darkness. Furthermore, the noise was deafening. She couldn't hear the ocean or the screams of her companions. The only thing filling her ears was the roar of the boat's engine, which was still running. Putting her hands up, her fingers brushed against a solid curved surface directly above her head. It was then that she realized the grim reality of her situation. The boat had capsized directly on top of her. She was trapped inside a small, cramped air pocket underneath the overturned hull. Panic began to set in. Diana started calling out desperately for help, trying to maneuver her body downward so she could swim out from under the curved edges of the boat. However, she quickly hit a major obstacle. Her life jacket was fully inflated and packed with buoyant air. The intense upward force made it physically impossible for her to dive down beneath the rim of the boat to escape. She was pinned to the ceiling of the air pocket by her own safety gear. The water was freezing, the kind of cold that could induce severe hypothermia in less than 30 minutes. As Diana fumbled around in the darkness, gasping for the limited air, she felt her hands brush against other people. There were others trapped in the air pocket with her. She grabbed onto them, trying to communicate, but everyone was in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic. With no way to swim down and no visibility, Diana realized their only option was to violently bang on the underside of the hull, hoping to alert whoever was on the outside that they were trapped within. Outside the overturned vessel, a different struggle was taking place. There were 11 people on the trip in total. When the boat capsized, 6 of them, including the skipper, a man named Mark, were thrown clear of the hull and into the open ocean. As Mark swam through the choppy water, he suddenly heard a distinct, frantic knocking sound echoing from beneath the upside-down boat. Mark immediately understood what was happening. While he and the other 5 survivors outside were facing a life-or-death scenario in the freezing ocean, the people trapped underneath were in far more immediate danger. Mark quickly gathered the 5 people with him to ensure they could stay afloat, and then he climbed up onto the slippery, exposed bottom of the flipped boat. He knew the vessel was large enough to support their weight without sinking further, and getting out of the water was their best chance at delaying hypothermia. Once on top, Mark began banging back on the hull, shouting to the people inside to let them know they had been heard. The scene was chaotic. The engine was still roaring loudly, the ocean was choppy, and nobody knew if the boat might suddenly sink to the bottom. In a stroke of luck, Mark checked the pockets of one of the survivors who had climbed up with him and found a cell phone. Despite being submerged, the phone miraculously still worked. Mark immediately called the emergency authorities, reporting the capsizing and emphasizing that multiple people were trapped under the water. The dispatcher assured him that a rescue team was being deployed immediately. Inside the dark pocket, Diana and the 4 others were running out of time. The air was growing increasingly thin, and the choppy water inside the cavity caused them to repeatedly gulp down mouthfuls of water as they struggled to keep their heads up. They kept pounding on the hull, begging for rescue. Some considered deflating or ditching their life jackets to attempt to dive to safety, but the risks were terrifying. Ditching their only flotation device in pitch darkness without knowing what debris or obstacles blocked the exit could mean drowning instantly. So they chose to wait, continuously knocking against the metal. True to their word, the rescue authorities arrived on the scene remarkably fast. They safely extracted Mark and the 5 other survivors from the top of the capsized vessel. Immediately after, rescue divers plunged into the water, swimming underneath the overturned hull to reach the air pocket. They found all 5 passengers, including Diana, exactly where they had been waiting. Tragically, however, all 5 were completely unresponsive. Despite the rapid arrival of the rescue team, all 5 individuals were pronounced deceased. When the medical examiners later conducted their investigation, they discovered a twist that no one could have anticipated. The 5 victims had not died from drowning, nor had they succumbed to the freezing hypothermia of the Pacific waters. When the massive whale originally rammed the side of the boat and caused it to flip, the violent impact had ruptured the vessel's internal gasoline lines. Because the boat was resting upside down, this rupture caused fuel to leak directly into the enclosed air pocket. The dark, freezing cavity where Diana and her companions were trapped had rapidly filled with highly toxic gasoline fumes. Within just 17 minutes of the capsizing, the concentrated fumes completely overwhelmed their respiratory systems, and all 5 passengers tragically died of gasoline poisoning before rescue could reach them. On Sunday, the 6th of November 2022, a 21-year-old man named Yevgeny Titov stepped out of his home in Yagolovsk, a small, quiet city located in western Russia. To anyone watching, it seemed like an ordinary weekend morning. Yevgeny calmly got into his car, turned the ignition, and drove about an hour and a half north until he reached a public parking lot. He parked his car, locked the doors, and walked a few blocks down the street toward the local train station. Upon entering the station, Yevgeny walked up to the ticket counter. With a calm and collected demeanor, he asked the clerk when the next available train was leaving for St. Petersburg. The clerk informed him that a train was scheduled to depart shortly. Yevgeny purchased a one-way ticket, walked out onto the platform, and sat down on a bench to wait. When the massive train finally rolled into the station, he climbed on board, found his assigned seat, and settled in. What followed was a grueling 3-hour journey, as St. Petersburg lay over 1,000 miles away. For nearly 2 full days, Yevgeny just sat in his seat, doing absolutely nothing to pass the time. He hadn't brought a backpack, a change of clothes, a book, or any food. He didn't even have a phone charger. The only item in his possession was his wallet. He simply stared out the window, watching the vast Russian landscape roll by, waiting patiently for the train to reach its final destination. Late on the night of Tuesday, November 8th, the train finally pulled into the station in St. Petersburg. Yevgeny, looking as calm as he had when he first started his journey, stood up and exited the train. From there, he traveled another 15 miles south to reach Pulkovo Airport. Investigators still do not know exactly how he made this final leg of the trip, whether he took a local bus, a secondary train, walked on foot, or hitched a ride with a stranger. Regardless of the method, he arrived at the airport in the dead of night. However, instead of entering the terminal to buy a plane ticket or board a flight, Yevgeny walked directly past the building and headed into a specific, secluded parking lot on the airport grounds. Several hours later, in the eerie, dark morning hours of Wednesday, November 9th, an airport employee was walking through that very same parking lot on their way to an early shift. The lot was mostly empty, and the air was freezing cold. As the person walked, they suddenly began to hear a strange, faint sound cutting through the silence. It sounded like muffled, distant screaming. At first, the traveler tried to rationalize the noise. Airports are busy places filled with stressed travelers, crying children, and people rushing around. Perhaps it was just someone goofing off or a child throwing a tantrum in the distance. But as they continued walking, the muffled screams grew louder and more desperate. Following the sound, the person's eyes landed on an open manhole cover situated in the middle of the parking lot. The terrifying truth became clear. The agonizing screams were echoing from deep inside the hole in the ground. For reasons that remain completely incomprehensible to this day, Yevgeny had approached that heavy cast-iron manhole cover, pried it open, and climbed down into the pitch-black subterranean world beneath the airport. At the bottom of the vertical shaft, the space was relatively wide, allowing a person to stand upright and move around. Branching off from this central chamber were various concrete and metal drainage pipes designed to carry water away from the airport grounds. Instead of staying in the wider, safer chamber, Yevgeny chose one specific pipe and lay down on his stomach. This particular pipe was made of rigid, rusted metal and measured a mere 30 centimeters, 1 foot in diameter. It was a space so incredibly narrow that a normal adult could barely squeeze their shoulders into it. Yet, Yevgeny plunged into the pipe headfirst, using his fingers and toes to deliberately crawl forward into the suffocating darkness. He didn't stop when the metal scraped against his skin. He didn't stop when the air grew thick and cold. He pushed himself forward, inch by inch, forcing his body deeper into the restriction until he had crawled nearly 12 meters for feet into the pipe. Finally, the laws of physics caught up with him. He had wedged himself so tightly into the narrow tube that he could no longer move forward, nor could he slide backward. He was completely paralyzed, trapped in a metal tomb under the earth. It was at that moment, in the dead of night, that the reality of his situation set in, and Yevgeny began to scream for his life. The traveler immediately called emergency services, and within minutes, the parking lot was flooded with police cars, fire trucks, and specialized rescue squads. Officers climbed down into the manhole and shone their flashlights into the pipe, only to see the soles of Yevgeny's shoes deep within the tunnel. The rescue operation was a logistical nightmare. The pipe was buried deep beneath thick layers of asphalt and concrete, and there was no way to pull him out by his feet without risking breaking his legs or snapping his spine. For hours, rescue teams used heavy jackhammers, industrial saws, and specialized digging equipment to break through the concrete of the airport parking lot. They carefully excavated the earth around the drainage system, working meticulously so they wouldn't collapse the pipe onto the trapped young man. Inside the pipe, Yevgeny was rapidly succumbing to the toxic underground gases and the freezing temperatures of the Russian winter soil. Somewhat unbelievably, after hours of intense, agonizing labor, the rescue crews managed to cut open a section of the metal pipe and pull Yevgeny out alive. He was immediately rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Yevgeny's survival was a miracle, but his body had paid a terrible price. He had to be hospitalized for a significant period due to severe, extensive skin damage caused by violently forcing his body against the rough, rusty interior of the 30-centimeter pipe. He also required intensive treatment for severe hypothermia and acute gas poisoning from inhaling subterranean fumes for hours. Following his remarkable physical recovery, authorities launched a massive, comprehensive investigation into the incident. The entire sequence of events defied logic. Why would a young man leave his home, travel over 1,000 miles without any belongings, just to crawl headfirst into a tiny drainage pipe beneath an airport parking lot? Was it a bizarre internet stunt? Was he fleeing from someone? Was it a drug-induced episode? When detectives finally sat down with Yevgeny in his hospital room to ask him these exact questions, they were met with a final twist that left them entirely baffled. Yevgeny was completely lucid, calm, and cooperative. However, he looked the investigators in the eyes and insisted that he had absolutely no memory of the past 3 days. He remembered being at home in Yagelovsk on Sunday, but everything after that, the 3-hour train ride, the airport parking lot, and the agonizing crawl into the 30-centimeter pipe, was a total, impenetrable blank. To this day, the true motivation behind Yevgeny's terrifying journey remains buried in the dark, beneath the concrete of Saint Reality. Petersburg. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In 2005, a man named Eric Martin was working his shift at a paper mill in Maine. He'd been at that same mill for 20 years, a long time. It was a normal day, and he was reaching up to get something off a high shelf when he felt a sharp, sudden pain in his back. It was bad. He had slipped a number of discs, and the injury was severe enough that it completely changed his life. The doctors told him he wasn't going to be able to work anymore. He was going to be on disability. And just like that, after 2 decades of the same routine, Eric was out of a job. His wife, Shelley Martin, hadn't been working at the time. She was raising their family. But with Eric's income gone, she knew she had to find a job, and fast. It wasn't easy, since she'd been out of the workforce for a long time. But through some connections, she managed to land a position in her old hometown, a small rural community in Maine called Palmyra. When I say small, I mean really small. We're talking about maybe 1,200 people living there. It was the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, surrounded by miles and miles of dense forest. The Martins also had a 17-year-old daughter named Chelsea. Understandably, she wasn't thrilled about the idea of leaving her friends and her school to move to a tiny town in the middle of nowhere. But the family didn't have a choice. Palmyra was the only place they could afford to live on their new, much tighter budget. But there was a silver lining. Because the cost of living was so much lower in Palmyra, they were actually able to get a bigger piece of property than what they had before. They found this beautiful old farmhouse that sat on a huge plot of land, several acres of it. The catch was, it was incredibly isolated. To even get to the house, you had to drive down a long, bumpy access road that led to their own private driveway. And once you were on the property, if you looked in any direction, all you could see was a 360-degree view of thick, dark woods. There were no hiking trails, no other houses in sight. It was just them and the forest. So, even though nobody was particularly excited about the move, they packed up their lives and headed to the new farmhouse. As they were unloading the truck, Eric picked up one of his many rifles. Eric came from a long line of hunters. It was more than a hobby for him, it was a huge part of his identity. He loved being out in the woods, and he had a whole collection of guns he used for hunting. But as he started to carry a rifle into the house, Shelley stopped him. She said, "Oh no, we're not keeping the guns in the house." This had always been a point of conflict in their marriage. Shelley just never felt comfortable having firearms inside the home, especially with their daughter living there. She told Eric, "You have a barn. You can put your guns in the barn." After some discussion, Eric finally agreed. He went out to the barn with his son Sean, who had come over to help them with the move. Together, they built a heavy-duty gun case for all of Eric's rifles. They made it solid and secure. They put the case inside the barn, locked the case itself, and then locked the barn door. The guns were definitely safe and secure out there, but they were also not easy to get to in a hurry. Over that first year living in the farmhouse, Eric and Shelley settled into a new routine. At the end of each day, they would make coffee and go sit out on the front porch together. They'd just sit there, sipping their coffee and talking, looking out over their front yard and the big open field that stretched out towards the tree line. It was a quiet, peaceful ritual that they both came to look forward to every single night. Fast forward almost exactly 1 year, it was early 2006. Eric and Shelley were on their front porch, having their nightly coffee, just chatting like they always did. The sun had gone down, and it was getting dark. As they sat there, Shelley noticed something. Way out at the edge of the woods, she saw a light. To understand what she was seeing, you have to picture the layout of their property. Right in front of the porch was a gravel area where they parked their cars. About 20 meters or so to the left was the big barn. Straight ahead from the porch was the huge, open field. It was like a grazing area with no trees. And then, hundreds of meters away, at the far end of that field, was the beginning of that dense, dark forest. The light Shelley saw was way out there, at the tree line. She described it as a pulsating light. It didn't look like headlights from a car, and besides, there was no road out there. It was just the edge of the woods. Eric saw it too, and his first thought was that it was a poacher. Someone was on his property, hunting illegally. He was not happy about it. He called for his son, Sean, who happened to be staying the night. He brought Sean outside and pointed toward the tree line. He asked him, "Hey, do you think that's a poacher down there?" Sean looked and said he wasn't sure, but it could be. Eric decided he wanted to go down there and tell whoever it was to get off his land. He asked Sean to come with him. Their plan was simple. They would just walk to the edge of the property and yell out, "Hey, this is private property. You need to leave." So the two of them started walking across the big, open field, heading straight for the distant tree line. As they got closer, they noticed that the pulsating lights began to fade. The lights seemed to be retreating back into the woods, deeper into the darkness. By the time Eric and Sean reached the edge of the forest, the lights were completely gone. Even though they were pretty sure the poacher had left, they decided to be thorough. They thought, just to be sure, let's walk a little ways into the woods and keep yelling. That way, whoever it was would definitely get the message. So they stepped into the forest. It was pitch black under the canopy of trees. The woods were very dense, with lots of low-hanging branches. It wasn't an easy place to walk. There were no paths or trails at all. They walked maybe 10 or 15 meters into the darkness, continuing to call out that this was private land. And then they both stopped. They heard a sound. It sounded like someone or something was walking parallel to them, maybe 15 meters away, off to their left. They could hear the crunch of leaves and the snapping of twigs. They both froze and looked in that direction, but they couldn't see anything in the dark. They didn't want to take any chances. They didn't know if they were being stalked by a mountain lion or some other predator. Eric and Sean looked at each other, and without saying much, they decided it was time to get out of there. The lights were gone, and they didn't like the idea of whatever was making that noise being so close to them in the dark. They turned around and quickly made their way back to the farmhouse. About a month went by after that strange night. It was now spring, and the first really nice weekend after a long, dark Maine winter had finally arrived. Chelsea's boyfriend, Nathan, was staying with the family at the farm. Feeling cooped up, Chelsea and Nathan decided it would be a perfect day to go for a walk in the woods. They took the family's 2 dogs and started walking across that same big field in front of the house, heading towards the same section of forest where Eric and Sean had seen the lights. At first, Chelsea had the dogs on their leashes. But once they got into the woods, she let them off so they could run around and burn off some energy. The 2 dogs immediately took off, running full speed for about 100 meters into the forest. Then, suddenly, they both came to a dead stop. They were standing right in front of a big mound. From a distance, it just looked like a pile of dirt. But as Chelsea and Nathan got closer, they could see it was something more. It looked like some kind of den. Huge pieces of wood had been leaned against each other to create a sort of lean-to structure. The entire outside of it was covered with moss and dirt and grass, making it blend in with the forest floor. It looked like it had been built very intentionally. On the front of the mound, there was a circular hole, like an entrance. The 2 dogs had stopped right at this entrance, and they were cautiously poking their heads in and sniffing. Chelsea and Nathan stood there looking at this strange structure. They wondered who could have built it. Was it something a hunter would make, like a blind? Or could an animal have made it? It seemed way too big and complex for any normal animal they could think of. But it was definitely made on purpose. Nathan, being curious, leaned down and tried to peer into the dark hole. He couldn't see anything inside, but he thought he heard a low growling sound coming from deep within the den. That was enough for him. Without a second of hesitation, he stood up and said to Chelsea, "We have to go." "I don't know what's living in there, but we need to get out of here." They quickly put the dogs back on their leashes and hurried out of the forest as fast as they could. When they got back to the house, they told Eric and Shelley what they had found. Sean happened to be there that day too. They described the strange man-made den they had discovered deep in the woods. As soon as they mentioned where they found it, straight out from the front porch, Eric and Sean looked at each other. That's when they told Chelsea and Nathan about their own experience a month earlier, about the lights and how they could have sworn they heard some large animal stalking them in that exact same area. The pieces of this strange puzzle were starting to come together, and none of them liked the picture it was forming. A couple of months passed. Life on the farm went back to normal, or as normal as it could be. One evening, Eric and Shelley were out on their front porch doing their coffee ritual. It was a cool night, and a low mist was hanging over the entire field, giving the property a slightly creepy vibe. As they were sitting there, they commented to each other about how spooky it looked. But then, their casual conversation took a turn. They both realized at the same time that they couldn't hear any wildlife. There were no crickets chirping, no frogs, no sounds of animals in the woods. Normally, at night, the air was humming with the sounds of nature. But on this night, it was dead silent. Shelley had this high-powered flashlight that she always kept with her on the porch. Feeling uneasy, she picked it up and started scanning the property with the beam. She swept the light across the field, over the barn, and along the tree line. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but the silence was just too odd. After scanning the whole area and seeing nothing, she put the flashlight down and went back to talking with Eric. Eric would later say in interviews that for some reason, the moment she put that flashlight down, a powerful feeling of danger washed over him. He was looking out into the misty darkness, and even though he couldn't see anything, every instinct in his body was screaming that something was wrong. All of a sudden, he turned to Shelley and said, "You know what? We need to go inside." "I don't know what it is, but we need to go inside right now." Shelley was a bit surprised. She said, "Come on, I want to stay out here a little longer. We'll go in a few minutes." But Eric was insistent. He stood up and said, "No, go inside." He tried to grab her arm to gently push her towards the door, but she was still resisting a little. And then, in that moment, Shelley stopped. She froze and whispered, "Did you hear that?" Eric immediately knew that whatever she heard was the reason for his sudden feeling of dread. He turned and looked out into the darkness, but he couldn't see anything. Shelley grabbed her flashlight again and started scanning the tree line. She moved the beam across the field, and when it got about halfway across, right in front of them, she stopped. Because right there in the middle of the field, illuminated by the flashlight's beam, were 3 creatures. They looked like massive wolves. They were just standing there, staring directly at them. And as they watched, 2 more joined them. Now, there were 5 of these huge wolf-like creatures all lined up in the field, all looking right at the porch. Shelley turned to Eric, her voice trembling, and asked, "What are those?" Eric, an experienced hunter who knew all the animals in the Maine woods, had no idea. He said, "I think they're bears. They could be wolves. We have to go inside." Shelley kept the light on them, frozen in fear. And then the creatures started charging. They ran directly at the porch, moving so incredibly fast that Shelley couldn't even keep the beam of light on them. They were already halfway across the field in a matter of seconds. Eric and Shelley scrambled inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Without even speaking a word to each other, they both went on a mission. They moved through the entire bottom floor of the house, locking every single window and closing every blind. They made sure everything was shut and secured. There was something about these 5 creatures that was different. The way they had charged at them, it didn't feel like a random animal encounter. It felt targeted. It felt like they were after them specifically. So even after the house was locked down, they didn't feel safe. They stood in the middle of their living room, and Eric's mind immediately went to his guns. He said, "My guns are in the barn. We have no protection in here." Shelley immediately told him, "Whatever you do, do not go out there. We don't know what those things are. Don't you dare go out there." Shelley then ran upstairs. She went through the second floor, shutting off all the lights and making sure every window was locked tight. Then she went to her daughter Chelsea's room. She woke her up gently and said, "Hey, come here. You have to look at this." They crept over to Chelsea's window. They didn't want to open the blinds all the way because they were terrified the creatures would see them. So they just peeked through a small crack. Shelley whispered, "Look." And there, standing on the gravel path right in front of the house, were the 5 creatures. They were just standing in a perfect row, looking directly at the house. It was like they were waiting. It was like they knew Eric and Shelley were inside and were just patiently waiting for them to come back out. It was not normal animal behavior at all. As Shelley and Chelsea watched, one of the creatures slowly looked up right at the window where they were hiding. And then the creature stood up on its 2 hind legs. Shelley gasped and stumbled backward, falling to the floor. The creature was enormous. It had to be at least 8 feet tall. Shelley was on the ground, looking up at Chelsea, her mind unable to process what she had just seen. How could it have even seen them? They were barely peeking out the window. And how could it stand up on 2 legs like that? And why were they all just sitting in a row outside their house, waiting? What was happening? Shelley pulled herself together and told Chelsea, "Get in your bed. Do not go near your windows. Do not leave this room." And that's when Shelley realized she hadn't heard their 2 dogs bark once during all of this. She started to worry that they might have been left outside. She began walking quietly through the upstairs rooms, calling their names softly. The dogs didn't come. Finally, she went into the master bedroom, and she found them. The 2 dogs were huddled together in the corner of the room, trembling. They looked completely terrified by whatever was outside. Meanwhile, Eric was pacing downstairs. He felt utterly helpless. He needed to get his guns from the barn to protect his family. But he knew it was a huge risk. With his bad back, he couldn't move very fast. He'd have to cross the open yard, unlock the barn, then pull down the heavy gun case and unlock that, all while being completely exposed to those creatures. He decided there had to be another way. He thought maybe he could run outside, get into his truck, and back it right up to the front door. Then he could get Shelley and Chelsea to run out and jump in, and they could just drive away. He went to a window and carefully pulled the blinds aside, just enough to look outside. The 5 creatures were gone. They were no longer standing on the gravel path. He couldn't see them anywhere. He let the blinds fall back into place. He thought, well, I don't know where they are, so it's still too dangerous to go out there. He started pacing again, his mind racing. After a few minutes, he went back to the window and looked again. This time, he saw them. They were back in the field where he and Shelley had first spotted them. All 5 of them were visible because the moon had come out from behind the clouds, illuminating the whole field. They were still facing the house. Eric thought, okay, maybe this is my chance. If I can keep my eye on them, maybe I can open the door, run to the truck, and back it up before they even notice me. So, without telling Shelley what he was about to do, he quietly unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the porch. He could see them clearly out in the field. They hadn't moved. As quietly as he could, he walked down the porch steps and started making his way across the gravel towards his truck, which was parked about 10 meters away. He kept his eyes locked on the creatures in the field. They still hadn't moved. They apparently hadn't seen him. He reached the driver's side of his truck. He had his keys in his hand and was fumbling to find the unlock button. And then it happened. The motion sensor security light attached to his house kicked on, flooding the entire area with bright light. He was so on edge that the sudden light startled him, and he dropped his keys. The first thing he did was look towards the field. He saw that one of the 5 creatures was now standing on its hind legs, looking directly at him. Before he could even bend down to get his keys, he saw all 5 of them start running towards him at full speed. He dove down, grabbed his keys, and ran for the house as fast as his injured back would allow. He slammed the door shut just as he heard them crossing the gravel right behind him. He heard their heavy bodies bound onto the front porch, and then the sound of them running around the wraparound porch. He was too scared to even look through the window, so he just ducked down to get out of sight. Shelley, who was upstairs, heard all the commotion and yelled down, "Eric, what's going on?" He just yelled back, "Stay up there! Stay up there!" The entire family was frozen. Eric, Shelley, and Chelsea were all just listening, knowing that those creatures were right on the other side of the wall, walking along their porch. After what felt like an eternity, he heard their footsteps leave the porch and go back onto the gravel. At some point, he finally got the courage to peek his head up and look out the window. All 5 of them were sitting there, again, right in front of the house, just facing it, as if they were waiting. Eric scurried up the stairs to where Shelley and Chelsea were. They were all terrified. They decided they had no choice but to call the police. They figured, if nothing else, a police car driving up with its lights on might be enough to scare the creatures away. Shelley made the call. On the phone, she tried to explain that they were scared of something on their property. She said there were 5 creatures, things, running around outside their house. The police officer on the other end of the line was immediately skeptical. He asked, "All right, ma'am, are you sure it's not a moose? Are you sure it's not a bear?" Shelley insisted it wasn't. She pleaded, "Can you please just come over here?" But the officer just said, "Listen, ma'am, just keep your doors and windows shut. I'm sure it'll be fine." And that's how the call ended. They were completely on their own. The family felt helpless. Eric, in particular, was frustrated and angry. He couldn't protect his family. He couldn't get to his weapons. He couldn't get to his truck. They were trapped. They decided the only thing they could do was barricade themselves inside the house. For the next 30 minutes, they worked together, pushing heavy furniture in front of all the doors and windows on the ground floor. They blocked everything as best they could. They went to the kitchen and gathered knives, and they found an axe they used for chopping firewood. With their makeshift weapons, they went upstairs and locked themselves in the master bedroom with their 2 dogs. They all got on the bed together. They decided all they could do now was wait for the sun to come up. During the time they were barricading the house, they had looked out the window from time to time. And each time, they saw the 5 creatures just sitting on the gravel area, waiting for them. But as soon as they finally went upstairs and locked themselves in the bedroom, they heard the creatures move. They heard at least a couple of them walk back onto the porch, and then it was totally silent except for the sounds of these creatures. It was clear they were communicating with each other. They would make strange howling and bumping sounds. It sounded like they were trying to coordinate some kind of attack on the house. The way the farmhouse was built, the second floor was a bit smaller than the first floor. This meant the first floor had its own separate roof that you could walk on right below the second floor windows. After a while, the creatures stopped walking on the porch. They heard silence, and then they heard a loud thud. They had jumped onto that first floor roof. The scary thing about this was that from that roof, you could walk right up to the second floor windows and look inside. So the family was lying there in the dark, listening. Periodically, they would hear them walking on the roof right outside their bedroom. There were windows on either side of the room they were in, with only thin curtains covering them. From time to time, one of the creatures would walk past their window and stop. They would hear it put its paws up on the window glass, and they could see its dark silhouette through the thin curtain. It was looking inside. All night long, they listened to these creatures running around on their roof. Sometimes they would hear a loud, violent scratching sound, as if they had found a weak spot and were trying to claw their way into the house. But after a whole night of this, they never actually broke through the glass. They never got inside. As the first light of dawn started to break on the horizon, the creatures jumped off the roof. The family could hear them running away back towards the forest. For about an hour, they sat in the room listening. They didn't hear anything else. The sun was up now, and they finally felt like it might be safe. They unlocked the bedroom door, went downstairs, and carefully moved the furniture away from the front door. They opened it up and stepped outside. All over their property, there was evidence of what had happened. There were massive footprints in the soft dirt, footprints with huge claw marks at the end of them. They found tufts of dark hair that had gotten caught on fence posts. And even scarier, they found all these spots on the house where the creatures had clearly tried to get in. The siding on the second floor, right by the windows, was shredded with deep scratch marks. The front door had been scratched to pieces. It was undeniable that whatever these creatures were, they had been trying very hard to get inside the house. But for some reason, they had been unsuccessful. This experience was so traumatic for the Martin family that they couldn't stay there. They put the house up for sale and they moved away as quickly as they could. They have never experienced anything like that since they left that isolated farmhouse in Palmyra. So what do you think those creatures were? Were they bears or wolves, or were they something else entirely? Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.